You're recording.
All right. Welcome to those who have joined us. We are the Utah Prevention Coalition Association, and this is the fourth in the series of applying for the Drug-Free Community Support Program. This training series, we've talked about things that you need and recommended different timelines of getting going, and we are going to continue on with our training today, specifically talking about budget. But before I do that, I just want to cover some of the things that we've covered before and refer back to this terminology sheet. I am really lazy and I use acronyms like crazy, and so I probably will, in the next couple of moments, use several of these acronyms. If you don't catch them, that's okay. We are recording this training, and you can go back, refer to this page, and figure out what I am talking about. I am going to take the first little part here, and following me will be Logan Reed. And if I didn't introduce myself already, I'm Rob Timmerman. I am one of the regional directors for the state's Partnerships for Success program, and also the executive advisor to the Utah Prevention Coalitions Association. There we go. I always forget to do that. So again, here's just some acronyms that we use and will be used throughout the presentation most likely. If I slow myself down and can catch myself, I will use the full full name of what I'm trying to explain. But if I don't, again, I apologize. We've mentioned the DFC program in our previous trainings and given information on what it is and what it supports. And today actually is kind of a fun one because we do talk about what the DFC program supports as we start talking about budget. And in doing so, we will make mention and provide information of the amount of requests that you can make, and also the amount of match that then that requires. Logan will touch on that. I'll touch on it a couple of times. But the DFC grant is a support program that, in doing so, they will come up with a non-federal match. We'll explain more about that as the training goes on. So it's a pretty significant grant program and has been extremely beneficial to hundreds, if not approaching thousands, of coalitions throughout the country, and has done some amazing things. In our previous trainings, we've given you some target dates. Now, as you're kind of maybe noticing, that a lot of those dates on this particular sheet have passed. And that's okay. Those were target dates, things that we recommended as we began to put together this training, of dates that would line you up to have an easier time of applying. And I say easier because, again, it is a pretty thick application itself. And if you stuck to some of these dates and did a lot of the organizing last month, you'll be right on track of applying for and spending the rest of the time between now and the application due date in putting together the bulk of your project narrative, your grant proposal, and then collecting all the other documents and putting those together as well. With that said, here's our purpose of today's training. We're going to talk about the DFC budget itself. I just mentioned some of the tasks and deadlines, and as we present, a couple more of those will come up. We have added this link down here, and I may take a moment and just be quiet if you want to put this into your browser or write this down really quickly. That link right there is to the just newly released FOA, or Federal Opportunity or Funding Opportunity Announcement. There we go, Funding Opportunity Announcement of the Drug-Free Community Support Program. So take a moment, write that down, put it into your browser, or whatever you want to do, and then I'll move on. It's pretty important to have that. This will give you kind of the gateway to the rest of the application itself, and provide further information on how, where, and what to do in terms of applying for the grant itself. We have mentioned some of those things in our previous trainings, but again, the announcement has just come out, and this is the link to follow that. So, okay, I promised I'd be quiet, so I will.
Rob, while you're being quiet, I'll just mention that if you go to Google and just type Drug Free Communities 2017, that's the first link that will come up. So if you don't want to write that whole URL, you can find it that way too.
Awesome, thanks. A couple of notes. Again, I've mentioned this. We've mentioned it in previous trainings, and we'll mention it several other times throughout the training today. The DFC grant program is a request for up to $125,000. And if you request $125,000, you will be required to match for the first 6 years $125,000. Years 7, 8, and 9, that escalates, and I've got a slide that will show that in a little bit. No more than 10% of the total budget can be used for data collection and evaluation. When you think of it, 10% of $125,000 is $12,000, $12,500, if my math is correct. And that is quite a lot of money, and you probably should not be contracting that much money with one entity anyway. So that said, that is a specific guideline that's given in the grant application process itself. No more than 10% can be used for evaluation purposes. The good news with the budget is there is no page limit. So you can throw as much stuff in there as you feel, and then you can start, as I backtrack from that statement in the next couple of slides, you'll see why. There is no page limit. However, you will find kind of a natural limit yourself as you go through the budget because of the requirements and suggestions and things that are allowable and not allowable. So why don't I get into that sort of stuff? I'll start talking about some budget terminology in just a second. But essentially, as you put together your budget, a thing to note is the budget is not scored in the peer review process. However, the budget is looked at and accounted for and taken into account prior to the applications even going through the peer review process. And what the DFC folks look for first are these things, and in the next several slides I'll explain them. They look through the budget to make sure that all of the budgeting items that you're requesting have met and will meet federal requirements. And if they don't, you will most likely be contacted, and if at all possible, the DFC folks will try to work with you to figure out why. Again, this is even before the review process itself. We are hopefully doing this training to help you avoid that step at all costs, and kind of pardon the pun there, but I guess I really do mean the pun. Things that, as we start talking about the budget, that we need to take into account are the proposal that you request, again, and the match that you put into your request as well, or into your application as well. All of your costs needs to be reasonable and necessary to accomplish your project objectives. We talked last time about the 12-month action plan, and all the things that are in your 12-month action plan cost money in one way or another, whether it's staff time or actual direct costs to accomplish an activity. All of those things need to be reasonable and necessary for you to be able to reach your project goals. The next thing is all of those costs need to be allowable in accordance with federal principles, and those federal principles can be found in the application or in the request for proposal. See, I've already done it. In the funding opportunity announcement itself, and you can find those on several different government websites, the Office of Management and Budget, as well as grants.gov and other places that you can find what federal cost principles are. All of these things also need to be auditable. Should you and your organization be ticked out for an audit, you need to show all proper accounting principles and be able to undergo and withstand an audit. Also, and it makes sense, everything that you put in your budget needs to occur during the project period. For the budget purposes, you will put down a proposal for 1 year that'll match the 12-month action plan that you've got. But you'll also project out a period of 5 years of what your budget you'll do that over 5 years. And so all the things that you're going to spend your money on as you propose it will need to happen during that project period. And then to make things simple for the DFC accounting people, all costs need to be rounded to the nearest dollar. So if that means rounding up or rounding down, however you need to do to help it fit within your request itself, you cannot put 12,592 cents. You need to just put 12,500. Makes sense. Now I mentioned I'd be going through some budget terminology, and so that's kind of what I'm going to do now. I will, at this point, make sure that you know that I am not an accountant, and so the explanation that I have of these definitions come from a little bit of knowledge in the nonprofit world, as well as the announcement itself, and you can find some of these definitions and further explanations on the announcement. But essentially, your project costs need to be reasonable, and I covered that a little bit already. They need to be allocable, and I'll get into the definition of that in the next couple of slides. They also need to be in conformance with any limitations or exclusions in the federal cost principles. Again, I mentioned some of that. Number 4, they need to be consistent with your regulations and the things that your specific policies and procedures already have in place. If you are awarded a grant, there is some documentation that you will submit to the grant management folks, and all of this will be submitted. You'll submit some practices and policies, and those including accounting things, and anything that you've got in your budget proposal needs to align and be consistent with those policies that you've already got set forth in your organization. And they also need to be federally supported, and making sure that any activity that you are doing as a registered nonprofit or governmental agency aligns with the practices of those two sections of the IRS code. Next, your budget, you need to make sure that things that you are indicating as a direct cost are actually direct costs, and if you indicate any indirect costs, that you are allocating things at an indirect cost rate. And I'll talk about indirect costs versus direct costs in just a moment. Again, I talked about accounting principles. Everything needs to make sure that it aligns with and is accepted by accounting principles that are used in the industry, and also that that the costs that you are projecting are not included in any other federal supported award. So if you have, and this primarily comes with our match segment again, and we'll give you more information on the match, but anything that you are receiving federally supported funding from cannot be included in the DFC grant itself. So let's talk about those cost principles. I don't mean to belabor the point, but they need to be reasonable. They need to align with the activities that you've got in your 12-month action plan. And they shouldn't be more, and for all intents, they shouldn't be less either. They should be prudent with what you've got going on in your action plan. So this may require a little bit of market research to figure out what the market, fair market value of something would be in your area. That can go down to daily allowances for travel, per diem rates, It's your responsibility to make sure that you do your research and propose a cost that is fair in the market that you are in. Now, for the state of Utah, we kind of fall in, kind of some generalities, and so this shouldn't be too hard to do. You are going to know how much rent is going to be in your area. You're going to know how much phone line may be in your area, and all those things need to be reasonable. Two, allocability. That's a really hard word, and I'm probably not even saying it right. But essentially, any cost that you've got to make sure that you can allocate the funds to, and that cost itself is has a kind of a category, maybe another way to say it, that you can fit it into a category itself for a specific project or for this specific grant. And so all of the costs that you propose need to be able to be attributed back to your 12-month action plan, essentially. And the things that you say that you are going to do need to be need to find a home or a category, or need to be able to be allocated to the grant itself. I talked about consistency and conformance, and I just wanted to touch on those again really quickly. Everything needs to fall into accounting practices, and you need to make sure that you avoid duplicating charges, that in your proposal itself that you don't have two different areas that are covering one specific item. You need to make sure that you avoid that as well. And conforming with any limitations and exclusions that the terms and condition of the award has. And I've got those listed in, I think it's this next slide right here. No, it's in a couple slides. I'm going to talk about direct costs and indirect costs. So direct costs is essentially anything that you are requesting in your project that you need money to cover. If you have not already negotiated or do not or will not negotiate an indirect cost, this is basically everything. And as Logan will show you in the budget template itself, all of those are direct costs. Anything from paying your salary for your project director and project coordinator, to benefits, to print paper or a projector or things like that. All the things that you need to do your project and meet your goals are direct costs, unless you have an indirect cost negotiated already with an entity that is your fiscal and legal agent. And so this only applies to those organizations that have an agreement already in place for indirect costs. There's some additional information that you can find on the announcement itself, and there is a form that you will need to attach with your application, or shortly after awarding, after having been awarded, you will be contacted to send that negotiation form in. Excuse me. But essentially, at a negotiated rate from your county or from your city or from your fiscal agent, chances are that you have done that as an indirect negotiation, indirect cost negotiation, and in doing so, you need to have that included in a form of information. The link to that form again can be found on the FOA itself. So most likely, indirect costs are not going to apply to you, but if so, you do need to make sure that anything listed as an indirect cost is not also listed as a direct cost. That kind of makes sense, but there is actually a special note on the FOA that you do need to be cognizant of that, making sure that if it is an actual indirect cost, you cannot get direct money for it. Rent may be one of those things. So I did promise that I would mention a couple of things that the DFC money does not pay for. And so really quickly, just going over some of those. This is not a fully exhaustive list, but from it you'll be able to get an idea. And if you've got questions, feel free to ask. And if Logan or I don't have the answers, we will contact the DFC people and get an answer for you. But generally speaking, after-school programs cannot be funded. So you can't get the DFC award and then create an entire after-school program and fund an after-school program from the DFC award. However, as a quick example, you can work with a partnering agency that runs the after-school program and support the things that they do, and perhaps say through this project we are going to implement a Bobbins life skills at a specific after-school program that's already going on, but we're just going to provide the curriculum through the grant project. You can do that, but you can't hire and run an after-school program with it. Same thing with youth mentoring programs. This cannot be used to fund Big Brothers Big Sisters. However, if Big Brothers Big Sisters is a partner of yours, you can work with them to fund a specific activity. So you can fund activities but not programs, if that makes sense. Same thing with your sports. If your area does not have enough money to run your junior jazz, the DSU program cannot be used to run your junior jazz. Also cannot use DFC money to run any treatment services. This is a prevention grant. It cannot be used to run treatment. Drug courts, kind of along the same line. Also, you can't do any construction. So if you're planning on building a new wing on your city hall to house offices for the drug-free communities director or coordinator, you cannot use the DFC funding for that. Park lighting, same kind of deal. That is considered an urban improvement project. You cannot use DFC money for that. Landscaping and neighborhood revitalization projects is something that you need to keep in mind. You cannot use DFC funding to reinvigorate a neighborhood or clean up somebody's house. That also means that everything on this list, you cannot use any of those things as a match, and none of these things can fulfill your match requirement. So what about food? People always ask about, can the DFC cover food? We want to do a community event, we want to bring people in, and we want to do hot dogs. Well, as you can see here, there is an allowance of up to $3 per person for activities and events. So if it's in your activity, in your 12-month action plan to host a town hall event or to have a community night out, you can use up to $3 per person for a small incentive for people to come out to your event. However, you cannot use the DFC money for food or meals at your coalition meetings or subcommittee meetings. That is not allowable, so don't even think about it. With that said, you also cannot use food as a match. So I want to, again, be clear on that. So if you've got a local agency donating food, however, you use that as a match. So really quickly on understanding what the match is. Again, every coalition that receives DFC funding is required to match for the first 6 years up to 100%. You've got to itemize your match just like you do your request. And as you're doing that, keep in mind that cash or in-kind support can be used for the match. So if it's not a cash donation, if it's time or use of equipment for free or at a discounted rate, that discounted rate can be used for your match. And just like your federal request, everything's got to meet the federal cost principles itself. So again, that last list that I showed you, because you cannot fund those from the DFC grant itself, you also cannot use those as match. The bold down here at the bottom is, if you, in your proposal, match in greater than 125%, let's say you are ambitious and you write your match proposal at $135,000, you are obligated to do $135,000. So you always have to match what you write in. So just keep it $125,000. It cannot be less than that. So make sure that you write that. Now, when you are accounting at the end of the year for your match, you can go over what you had projected, and that actually oftentimes happens. I'm going to try to move to a different situation. Someone just sat next to me and is talking on the phone. Okay, so maybe if this is a little bit quieter, I'm going to try this right here. My part's almost done anyway. So in kind, I just put a couple of things here that are generally considered as in kind. Office space, again, if you're getting office space donated from your county or library or your school, you can count that as a match for in kind. Again, if it hasn't already been negotiated at an indirect cost rate. Volunteer people that are working for your coalition on a volunteer basis. Anything that's pro bono with the South Salt Lake Coalition, I often had people do stuff for us for free, and when they did stuff for us for free, I was able to count that as match. Now, sorry, I'm getting people walking by.
Okay, let's do it next week. I'm actually out tomorrow.
I'm so sorry, that's a little bit annoying. Anyway, the understanding the match continued. Again, for the first 6 years of the DFC program, you need to match up to 100%. Years 7 through 8, it's 125% of $125,000. And years 9 and 10, it's 150%. Now, Logan always throws this one in, and I always try to take the time to delete it, but I never do. But that will conclude my part, and I will be available to answer any other questions at the end after Logan has gone through. So now, Logan's going to switch out who is driving the presentation at this point. So I will say thank you, and again, I'll hold on to answer any questions.
Thank you, Rob. Are you seeing my screen now?
I am seeing your screen, yep.
All right. Yeah, Rob always tries to take that picture out, and I always put it back in. Thanks, Rob. Just for those who may not know, just to illustrate how dedicated Rob is, he had another presentation and meetings this morning. He didn't have time to get back to his office, so he's still doing this for us, even though he's having to sit in a lobby. So thank you, Rob. I remember the first time that I wrote the DFC grant, I was overwhelmed with a lot of things, but nothing more so than the budget. I felt like I had a handle on the attachments and on the narrative, but the budget really freaked me out. I didn't even know where to start. And maybe especially after all of these details that we've just gone through, it might seem a little overwhelming, a little daunting. The truth is, the budget is not that hard. Especially if you have your action plan done already. So I just wanted to start. My advice before we get into more details about how to write this is don't worry, don't freak out. The budget really isn't that hard if you take it step by step. And I think that you'll see that it's actually quite easy as we go through this. So if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed after all that information that we just went through, don't worry. It's not as difficult as it might seem. And the first thing that I want to say about the budget is that this is where you pay for your action items, your strategies. Rob just explained that to us, but I wanted to just reiterate it. If you have already done your action plan and set your goals, writing the budget is really easy. If, for example, Rob mentioned Botvan Life Skills. Let's say that, for example, you made a goal to implement Botvan Life Skills at your local middle school. In your budget is where you will request the money to pay for that curriculum and for that training. If you said that you were going to do a take-back event and advertise it really well to get the community to participate, in your budget is where you'll request money to pay for that. What else? If you said that you're going to pay police officers to do an alcohol server training in your community, this is what you would write into your budget. So your budget should support your action plan. It should tie directly into your action plan. If it doesn't, you won't score well. The reviewers want to see that you're spending money on things that will accomplish the goals that you laid out in your action plan. So let's jump into it. My goal here is to just break it down step by step and look at each piece of the budget, and we'll go slow. And if you have any questions, we can take them at the end, but also feel free to jump in. If you've got questions and you want to stop me and have me give more clarification on something, please feel free to do that. The budget is broken down into 7 different categories. You have personnel, so this is any money you're going to use to pay someone to work on the grant, like a grant coordinator. You have fringe, which are the benefits or for anyone that you hire as personnel. So if you're going to hire a grant coordinator, their salary would go under personnel, but their benefits, their workers' comp, etc., that would all fall under fringe. And your fiscal agent can tell you exactly what numbers to use there, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. The third category is travel, which includes the required trainings that you have to attend if you get the grant, as well as any other travel costs, like maybe going to the Utah Fall Conference or even your local travel costs to administer the grant. The fourth category is equipment. That's a tricky one. Most of you will not be putting anything under equipment, but the criteria for that is anything that you can't rent for cheaper, has a useful life of more than 1 year, and an acquisition cost of more than $5,000 per unit. I think Rob might have mentioned that, but in most cases, you're not going to have equipment costs for your grant. The fifth category is supplies. That includes simple things like computers, printers, general office supplies, the things that you need to carry out the grant. 6 is contracts. Contracts are any money that you are going to contract to someone else. Like maybe you're going to contract Bach Harrison to be your evaluator, or you're going to contract Rob to provide consultation on environmental strategies, or contract your police department to provide training to your coalition, etc. Anything that you're contracting somebody else to do would fall under this category. And then finally is the other category, which is basically anything that doesn't fit into those other 6 that I mentioned. So for each of these categories, you're required to show how much you're asking for, or how much you're planning to spend in each category. And you also have to show how much match, which the grant refers to as non-federal request. The way that I think of it is how much you're requesting of the federal government, and then non-federal request is how much you're requesting from your community, or how much you're finding in your community to match your federal request. So it's important to note that these 2 columns do not have to match going across. Sorry, the rows don't have to match going across. If you request $25,000 from the feds in personnel, you do not have to request 25, or you don't have to have 25,000 in your non-federal match. The only thing that you have to worry about is that your total requests equal $125,000, and your total match needs to equal $125,000, which means that your total grant will be $250,000 or more if you have more than $125,000 in your match. So just make sure that your totals add up going down your columns, but don't feel like because you requested $25,000 in personnel from the government that you have to also have $25,000 in match under that same category. You just have to make sure that you have a total of $125,000 in match if that's what you're asking for as a request. Hopefully that made sense and wasn't really confusing. If it is, we can clarify more on that. So let's talk about the format of the budget. It's pretty straightforward. For each of the categories listed here, you are required to give the details of the expenses in a table format, like you see here, with a brief paragraph or narrative justifying why you'll be spending that much. And then you have to list where your match funds come from, how much total match you have for that category, and how much federal request you have for that category. So each section of your budget, in other words, for each of those 7 categories that I mentioned, you'll have a budget that looks like this. So I just want to show you some examples. We'll start with personnel, and we'll just go through some of those categories. And if you have questions about this, feel free to ask. This first one is an example of the personnel section, which is the first section of your budget. So this is what we are requesting from the federal government. And I should note here that you don't have to request something in every category. There are many coalitions, for example, that don't put money into personnel. I think actually the Penguich Prevention Coalition this year hasn't put any money under the personnel section. But if you were to request personnel money, this might be what it would look like. For this section, you would list the position that money is going toward, the name of the person who will be in that position. If you don't know, you can put something like to be hired, and then the payment rate or salary of that person. This is where your finance office can help you. They can tell you how much the position would cost. You want to be careful here to make sure that any salaries are reasonable. I'm not going to talk more about that because Rob covered it really well. But just make sure that they're reasonable for the job and for your community. If the reviewers think that you're asking way too much or even way too little, they're going to question that. So I recommend making sure that you can justify the amount if you're ever audited. So look at similar jobs in your community or in the state. So if you were asked to show why you picked that number, you would have a good answer to that. Next, you'll list how much of their time will be spent working on the grant. So in this case, if Rob's going to be the director who oversees the grant, he's not going to spend 40 hours a week working on it. He'll just be providing oversight and helping out where needed. So I'm going to say he'll spend 10% of his time working on the grant. So if his salary is $40,000 a year and he's going to spend 10% of his time helping with this grant, we only need to put $4,000 of the grant toward his position. However, if Melissa is going to be the coordinator and all of her time is going to be spent working on the grant, then I put 100% under the level of effort. And then at the end of the row, I put the cost for each person for the year, and then I total it out. So in this example, I'm requesting $48,000 of the grant to pay for personnel costs. Again, this is just an example. Yours might look very different from this. The next thing, once you've created that table, the next thing that I need to do is write a short paragraph justifying those expenses. So you can see that I just quickly listed what the responsibilities will be for each of those positions and why they will be beneficial to the coalition and to accomplishing the goals of the grant. The next thing I need to do after I've done this is the exact same thing with my match funds. So I have to list any match that I might be using for personnel. And remember, it doesn't have to be the same as what I'm requesting. In this case, I'm going to keep Rob there because maybe his agency agreed to donate 10% of his time to the grant. Maybe I add on the clinical director from my agency because they agreed to let him provide some technical management and training to our personnel. Maybe I add on our finance officer because they agreed to let him handle the finances for the grant. I'm giving these examples because the first time I wrote the DFC, this is what my agency did for me. They said, we'll donate this time to the grant so that you can use it as match funds. So again, this is just an example. Yours might look very different, but this shows you what it would look like. And then once again, I'm going to put a narrative justification. So I'm going to explain what those funds will be used for that are being donated to me. The final item that you need to list here is where your match funds are coming from. So in the example that I just gave, they're coming from the county tax funds that support our behavioral health agency. But that might be different from yours. Maybe money's coming from state alcohol tax. Maybe it's coming from corporate donations. Maybe your school district is donating time. Maybe your city. Whatever it is, you're just going to list where those funds are coming from. And then you need to include the overall price. So if you remember, I was requesting 48,000 of personnel. and 15,000 in my non-federal match. So that's what I would list here. I'm going to list the source of my match funds, how much I'm requesting from the federal government, and how much my community is donating to this grant. So when this section is all said and done, I'll have an overview of the details of the expenditures for the money that I'm requesting, and I'll have a short narrative justifying those expenses. And then the same thing for the match, and then the source and the totals. So my final product will look something like this. This is an example from the funding announcement, that link that Rob showed us at the beginning here. In that document is where this example comes from. And they provide one of these examples for every one of those 7 categories. It tells you what to say in your narrative justification. They even put in parentheses where you enter the totals in the final budget form, which they refer to as SF424A. You don't have to, don't worry about that right now. I'll talk about it in just a second. But you don't have to leave those parentheses. They're just putting that in there to tell you where you're going to put that information in another document. Well, in fact, let's look at that really quickly. I think I put that in here next, just to talk briefly about that SF424A. All it is a summary. So at the end of your budget, you will include Form SF424A, which is a summary of your budget. You'll list how much you're requesting for each category, how much you have in match for each category, and the total amount. And you'll notice there's actually a typo in the FOA here. They put $1 billion in their match funds under total direct costs. But I think what they meant to say was 124,000. The most important thing to remember here is that your total match has to equal or be higher than your total request, which is what Rob was just telling us about. You can't request more than you have in match. So you can see in their example, they're requesting $121,000. They have $124,000, that's what it's supposed to say, in their match funds for a total of $246,000. You'll also notice what I was saying here. The match funds don't necessarily match up with your federal request for that same category, which is fine. They don't have to match up across. They just have to match up and down. You have to have a total of, well, you have to have more match funds than you are requesting. Again, hopefully that makes sense. So just to review really quickly here, there are 7 categories in your budget: personnel, fringe, travel, equipment, supplies, contracts, and other. For each of those categories, you're going to create a detailed budget that lists the costs and the amount that you're requesting, with a brief narrative justifying those costs. You'll do the same thing for the match funds, and then you'll list where those match funds came from and the totals from your request and your match. And after you've done that for each of those 7 sections, you'll fill all of that information into this budget summary, which is referred to as SF424A. So let's quickly just look at some of the other sections. I gave you this example of personnel, but let's look at some of those other sections. We'll start with fringe. Sometimes the fringe benefits can be scary because these are things that most of us don't deal with on a daily basis. I know the first time I applied, I got to the fringe section and I had no idea what that even meant. But I went to our agency's finance director and he smiled and said, I can give you those numbers in about 5 minutes, which he did. I showed him my personnel budget, like the one that we were just looking at here. And then I showed him this sample table, and he put all the numbers in for me and emailed it back to me 5 minutes later. So if you're not sure about this fringe, your fiscal agent can probably help you do this very quickly. Above each template in the sample they give you in the grant, they give a little info about what they're looking for. So you can see I copied that text and put it here on the right. They tell you what fringe benefits include, which is Social Security, insurance, pension plans, workers' comp, etc. So again, this part of the budget is sometimes scary, but my experience is that your finance officer can do it for you in a matter of minutes. And with each of these sections, they'll give you details about what they're talking about. So let's jump to travel. This is the next section after fringe benefits, and there are a few things that are required to budget for in your travel section. If you get the grant, you have to send 2 key personnel to the new grantee meeting, which they hold in Washington, D.C., and it's always in December. You're also required in the first year of the grant to send 2 coalition members to the National Coalition Academy, which is a 3-week training. So you have to budget for those 2 things in your grant. So the training budget includes the purpose of travel, the location you will travel to, the item of cost, so like airfare, hotel, airport parking, car rental, mileage to the airport, per diem for meals, etc. All of those cost items. And then you'll include the rate for each of those things. So you can see on this example, they listed flights as being $300, but there are 2 of them going, so it's going to be a total cost of $600. And since you're estimating here, make sure that you estimate high enough to cover fluctuations in flights. But like Rob said, also make sure that it's reasonable. If they see that you've listed $5,000 for a flight from Salt Lake City to Denver, they're going to nail you on it in an audit. What I typically do is go on Google Flights, I put in the dates and see what the average flights are going for, and then I bump it up about $50 or $75 just to give me some breathing room in case prices go up. So you have to send 2 people to the new grantee meeting. You have to send 2 people to the Coalition Academy. After that, you can include other travel expenses that you might have, like going to a CADCA conference or an NPN conference or the Utah Fall Substance Abuse Conference or maybe the Utah Coalition Summit. However, I will tell you that they're getting a little bit more strict on how much they allow you to spend on travel for this grant. They don't like to see $20,000 in your travel budget. They get antsy between $10,000 and $12,000 in my experience. So just be aware, some Utah coalitions have had some pushback on their travel budgets, so keep that in mind when you're creating them. Travel can be very beneficial to building capacity of coalition members, but you also have to make sure that it's reasonable according to their standards, which might be a little lower than yours as far as how much you can spend. Another section that I wanted to talk about was the contract section of your grant. It could be a big section of your grant. One of the items that you will have in this section is evaluation. As Rob mentioned, you have to have an evaluator for your grant. It's a requirement, but you can't spend more than 10% of your money on evaluation. So like he said, no more than $12,500. Sometimes this is a good way to get some good match funds too. Often evaluators will donate a good portion of their time to you to use as match. For example, we use Bach Harrison as our evaluator. They're the analysis company that does the SHARP survey for us in Utah. And we use them on both of the DFC grants that we have down here in southern Utah. Well, all 3 of them that we have here in southern Utah, which is great because they've already done a lot of the work that you have to do for your reporting if you get the grant. But they donated $8,000 to me in match funds when I applied for this grant, which was really good. That was a way for me to get a lot of match funds. So whoever you choose as an evaluator, I would recommend that you request match funds from them. You might also use this section to bring in trainings for your coalition. For example, Ashley with the Kane Community Coalition used DFC money to contract some people at the state division to come in and do some environmental strategy training for her coalition. I contracted the state to come down and do a SAPS training for my coalition, and they actually donated about half of the cost to me to use for match, which was nice. We contracted Rob to come and provide some consultation to our coalitions. Other coalitions have contracted me to come in and do youth coalition training for them. The Washington Coalition put money into their contract section to help pay for the Utah Alcohol Policy Summit and to bring trainers into their county substance abuse conference. So there are a lot of things that you can use the contract section for, but once again, make sure that they relate back to your action plan. So for example, I mentioned that we put money in to help pay for the Utah Alcohol Policy Summit, and that's because under one of our goals, we had talked about increasing our efforts to get information out to policymakers about the dangers of underage drinking. And since that is the main topic of that policy summit, and it's specifically for our policymakers, it made sense for us to put money into that. So just make sure that whatever you're writing into your budget relates back to your action plan and your goals. There are also a lot of ways, as I mentioned, that you can get match funds for the contract section. I talked about evaluation. Other examples might be, does your police department do compliance checks in your community? If so, you might be able to use that as match funds. Does your school district run a student assistance prevention program that ties directly into your action plan? If so, you might be able to use that for match funds. Does your newspaper let you publish a newsletter for free? Most importantly, this is where you can count the volunteer time for your coalition members. If you add up how many hours your coalition members volunteer, including your monthly meetings, your subcommittee meetings, maybe you do a community family night or a take back day or parent seminars, maybe you have a youth coalition that does activities once a month. If the average wage in your county is around, say, $30 an hour, and you add up your coalition volunteer time and come up with around 1,000 hours, which is very possible. If you have 20 coalition members and they're all dedicating a couple of hours a month to coalition activities, that adds up pretty quickly. So it's very possible that you could come up with $30,000 in match funds just from your coalition, or more. 40,000, 50,000 maybe is not even unreasonable for that. So under the match section of your contracts, you can probably make up a lot of that $125,000 that you're shooting for, specifically by using the volunteer hours from your coalition members. The last thing that I wanted to mention is that at the end of your budget, after you fill out that 424A section, another part of that is to give a future year's budget summary. So remember that this grant is a 5-year grant. So you have to do that detailed budget that we just talked about for each of those sections for year 1. But then they also want you to just say, what is it you're expecting to request for year 2, 3, 4, and 5? Which is probably going to be the same thing that you're requesting in year 1. You're probably going to request $125,000, and you're probably going to have a match of at least $125,000. Then after that, they want you to give some more details. They just want you to map that out. So they have this table that's in the FOA, so you can see this example, and they give you some information about it. But essentially, they're just asking you to map out each of those sections. So you can see here we've got contracts, supplies, equipment, travel. They've also detailed out some of your personnel costs and some of your contract costs. And they want you to just project how much you're going to spend on that for the 5-year grant. So that's what this final table is. They're asking you to give future years how much you're going to be asking for and how much match you're going to have for each of those areas for the 5 years of the grant. So that's a lot of information we've thrown at you. Now, do you have any questions? Are there specific questions that you have for Rob or I? Are there anything that you want us to review or go over, or anything that wasn't very clear? We're happy to answer any questions if you have some. Rob, is there anything that you wanted to add on to what I was just saying?
No. Actually, I thought you did a great job of kind of hitting everything. I think, again, Logan did really good in stressing not to stress. That's the thing. Don't stress about the budget section. It ends up not being bad once you've aligned everything with your action plan. It's not like you're making stuff up to get into your budget. Everything's already there. And it's really simple to do.
Well, if there are no specific questions for us, then just as a reminder, for our last webinar, it's going to be on February 23rd. And what we're going to do on that is we're going to review once again. We've already done this in a previous session, but once again, we're going to review some of the details on submitting your application. We'll even show you what the submission document looks like, and we'll kind of review that for a few minutes. And then we'll just open it up to questions. So hopefully by that time, you've had an opportunity to work on most of these things. You've done your all of your assurances and other documents. You have a narrative and an action plan draft done. You've got a draft of your budget done. And so hopefully, February 23rd, when we meet, we can answer any questions that have come up as you've been writing these things and help you kind of finalize your application. As a reminder, we record all of these, so this session will be up later today on our website. All of the previous 4 sessions that we've done are already up on the website, so if you go to utahprevention.org, click on trainings, and then click on the drug-free communities link, it will take you to a YouTube video of all of the previous sessions that we've done here. If you have specific questions that come up as you're working on this over the next month, feel free to send us an email or a text and let us know what those questions are so that we can make sure we prepare to answer them in our final training. And good luck. Once again, as Rob just reiterated, don't let this overwhelm you. Pick one thing that you can work on and start on it and get that done, and then move to the next thing. And you'll find that you actually start moving through these pretty quickly. And if you start getting stressed or have questions and you're not sure where to go with this, give us a call. We're happy to help any way that we can. We are not experts. We don't have all the answers, but we do have quite a few years of experience working with these grants, so we'll help you any way that we can. In the meantime, good luck. Your applications are going to look great, and we hope to have you back here on the 23rd of February. Everybody have a great day, and we'll see you next month.